Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer requested presentation, we're finally going to be tackling a classic SKS question, which is what exactly does the term Sino-Soviet mean, and how can you tell if an SKS is indeed a Sino-Soviet? This is going to be fairly convoluted, so we won't waste any time, and we'll jump right in. In order to provide an honest and comprehensive answer to this question, the first thing we need to do is acknowledge a critical but often ignored reality of the gun collecting world, which is that collectors have a penchant for making up categories and terms which haven't existed historically. What I mean by this is that the pursuit of collecting oftentimes emphasizes certain firearm characteristics which are only relevant through the lens of history, but weren't particularly noteworthy at the time. Therefore, new language and labels are required to categorize these firearms according to those newly significant traits. Now, let's be clear, this isn't a bad thing. In fact, this phenomenon is probably an inevitable consequence of the mechanism by which collectors generate nuance, depth, and even novel insights. The problem is that the evolution of language can be a messy process, and just because a new term successfully enters common parlance doesn't mean that it will make sense or remain tied to a single cohesive definition. Rational and self-evident terminology isn't always favored by the organic development of language and often gets outcompeted by glitzy slang terms. In order to demonstrate what I'm talking about, here are two of my favorite production variants of the Chinese Type 56 carbine. If I want to efficiently communicate to the vast majority of my audience what these variants are, I'm going to use invented collector terms like ghost and French tickler. Many of you already know what I'm talking about, but the point here is that you only know what I'm talking about because once upon a time, the right people arbitrarily and probably unintentionally decided that these would be the words we agreed to use. Ghost and French tickler are obviously not historical translations, and in fact, their meanings are anything but self-evident. They aren't totally arbitrary either, but the connections between those chosen terms and the collections of empirically evident traits that they represent is fairly tenuous, especially if you aren't a middle school boy. This ghost could have easily been called a pre-stamp, or a blank, or a first run. This French tickler could have easily been called a final pattern 26, an encore run, or literally anything other than an adult novelty item best associated with truck stop bathrooms. That's not how the world works, however, and because those terms were catchy, they are the terms we're stuck with. The good news is that regardless of where these terms came from or how much intrinsic value they do or don't have, people tend to agree on what they mean. At the end of the day, that's really all that matters. After all, if you deconstruct far enough, all words are made up nonsense anyway. But as long as we all agree which empiric realities these combinations of syllables point to, the words have utility and therefore conditional value. So with all that context in place, we can circle back to the term Sino-Soviet. The first thing we need to understand, of course, is that Sino-Soviet is an invented collector term rather than a historically defined category. That's very important. What that means is that what is or isn't included in the term Sino-Soviet is ultimately up to us, but we all need to be on the same page in order for that term to have value, and this is where the problem arises. There are multiple competing definitions for the term Sino-Soviet, and they mean very different things. First, there is a strict collector definition, which is popularly used in communities such as the SKS files, in which Sino-Soviet refers to the extraordinarily rare 2,000 pre-production models, which were made at State Arsenal 296 in 1956 as essentially a dry run prior to the beginning of full-scale production. This trial assembly of pre-made parts kits was a standard part of the Soviet technology transfer program, and interestingly, an element that the Chinese preserved when years later they themselves would train foreign allies on SKS production. In any case, these specific rifles are best identified by the fact that they have serial numbers between 1 and 2000 and are built on Tula marked receivers. That said, identifying these rifles is really not a practical skill for the average SKS enthusiast because I wasn't kidding when I said that they are extraordinarily rare. Last I heard, there's less than 20 documented examples in North America, and it's not likely that many, if any, additional examples will turn up. They are extremely cool and certainly worthy of recognition as a distinct and tremendously important variant of the Type 56 carbine, but for the vast majority of us, they will always be a concept rather than something out there that exists and is accessible to contemporary collectors. In any case, some of the powers that be in the SKS world have decided that these variants are called Sino-Soviets. And if everyone got that memo and just moved on, I guess that would have been fine. The problem is that not everyone intuitively accepts this definition, and frankly, I don't blame them. Unlike French tickler and ghost, Sino-Soviet is a fairly descriptive and self-evident term, which paints an obvious picture of a blend between Chinese, Sino, and Russian, Soviet traits. Well, those extraordinarily rare pre-production models are not the only variants which could logically be described as a blend between Chinese and Russian. The influence of Soviet technical advisors in Chongqing, to include Malantsev, Priviltsev, Liskin, Beria, and others, didn't magically evaporate after the successful pre-production run. That's just not how these things work. The Chinese didn't spend months and months training their technicians to speak Russian just to knock out 2,000 rifles and wing it from there. This was a professional operation which took years to stabilize, and even after the breakdown of Sino-Soviet relations, or Soviet and Chinese relations, in 1961 approximately, the Soviet influence on the Type 56 carbine would never fully disappear. This here commercial conventional carbine was manufactured in 1988, more than 3 decades after that original pre-production run ended. And yet if we look closely, we can see that the battle sight setting on the rear sight is still marked with a Russian or Cyrillic P. Russian language marked sights would remain by far the most popular of the 4 rear sight marking styles utilized throughout the duration of Chinese SKS pattern production. And forgive me, but it's hard to argue that the persistence of Russian markings on Chinese rifles isn't a Sino-Soviet element, because it is. The confusion that this leads to is that people independently have defined Sino-Soviet according to what makes sense to them, and a lot of them have pretty rational arguments. I'm by no means saying that we should consider all Chinese rifles to be Sino-Soviet. I'm trying to highlight the confusion that comes when people accurately recognize Russian elements on Chinese guns and logically apply the term Sino-Soviet to describe those characteristics. One popular use of the term Sino-Soviet is in reference to Type 56 carbines made in 1959 and 1960, which utilize Soviet-style serialization. Now, in the more niche SKS collecting communities, we typically call these rifles letter rifles or letter series. But if you're shopping for one of these letter series rifles on Gunbroker, your best search term is going to be Sino-Soviet. Confusing, right? This is the pitfall of invented nomenclature, especially vague nomenclature. We can hoot and holler all day long about how these Gunbroker sellers are using the wrong terms and just don't know enough, but we don't have a monopoly on words, and the fact is that they aren't actually wrong. The only reason that letter series rifles have letters on them is because Soviets put letters on their rifles, and the Chinese briefly conformed to this Soviet technique. That defining characteristic is therefore a fusion of Chinese and Russian elements. So again, you can't tell me that Sino-Soviet isn't technically an appropriate label for that. It is. Quite frankly, if everything was up to me and we were starting from a blank slate, I would have proposed that the term Sino-Soviet would refer to all State Arsenal 296 manufactured Type 56 carbines manufactured prior to 1961, as evidenced by the absence of the 3-character Chinese Type 56 marking. I personally believe that the first appearance of the Chinese characters on this rifle, both literally and symbolically, represented the end of the era of Sino-Soviet cooperation and the beginning of truly independent nationalist Chinese production. That's what would have made the most sense to me anyway. That said, we aren't working with a blank slate, and the term Sino-Soviet is well established. And regardless of what it could mean, the fact is that people haven't gotten on the same page about what it does mean, and therefore it is a generally useless term. Most of the time that I hear the term Sino-Soviet in discussion today, I need to immediately get clarification on what the person is talking about. And that's a red flag of a useless term, as the whole point of a term is to skip that clarification part. In summary, if you came to this video wondering what the term Sino-Soviet means in the context of Chinese SKS collecting, the unfortunate truth is that it almost never means anything useful. Like many collector terms, it is a truly modern invention rather than something rooted in a historical consensus. Unlike some collector terms, however, it's fairly professional and formal sounding, which is nice, but it suffers from the fatal flaw of being ill-defined. The literal meaning of the term is generally applicable, and yet the community has tried to apply it to a highly specific variant, which has inevitably resulted in confusion and inconsistency. Collector terms that lack a consistent definition also lack utility and therefore lack any value whatsoever. Perhaps one day a true consensus will emerge, but until that day, I encourage people seeking clarity to avoid the term Sino-Soviet altogether and instead use more consistently defined language, such as pre-production model, letter series, or pre-61, depending, of course, on what you're talking about. And that's the video, everyone. Thanks so much for giving it a watch. I know that might have been an unsatisfying answer to some of you, but it is the truth, and it is what I'm aiming for on this channel. If you did like this content, you're probably going to see some stuff on the screen somewhere about a recommended video, probably an SKS playlist, and a subscribe button. So if you did like this, please check out my other stuff. Comment, like, subscribe. Those are the things that motivate me to make more videos, totally free for you, and it directly results in more content. So if that's what you're into, that's how you make it happen. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope to catch you in future videos.